Welcome to our deep dives into the Columbine High School tragedy. We're going to be using Dave Cullen's book, Columbine, to kind of go beyond the headlines, and the stories we think we know.
Yeah, you've provided a ton of material and it really highlights how easy it is to just stick with the oversimplified narratives. But the truth, as Cullen reveals, is much more nuanced and frankly disturbing.
So we're going to uncover that. The truth behind the myths, a better understanding of the psychology of the people involved, and the impact on the survivors, all while avoiding the sensationalism, we so often see.
Yeah. And I think what Cullen uncovers will surprise you.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think the biggest thing, most people kind of remember is that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were these bullied outcasts. And, this was an act of revenge. Were they?
Well, that's the prevailing myth, and Cullen debunks it thoroughly. For example, he reveals in Eric Harris's journal that he fantasized about starting a global war. This points to an ideology that goes way beyond just revenge on classmates.
So what were their motives?
Well, Eric Harris emerges as what's called a classic psychopath.
And for those of us, who may not be totally familiar with that term.
Sure, a psychopath in this context means someone who exhibits a distinct lack of empathy, a desire for control, and a disregard for the consequences of his actions. And these traits were evident in Harris's writings and his actions leading up to the attack. His goal wasn't revenge, it was chaos and notoriety. Think of it more like terrorism than a typical school shooting.
You mentioned the media earlier, and I'm curious about one story in particular that always kind of stuck with me, Cassie Bernal. The story was that she was asked if she believed in God and then killed for saying yes.
Yeah, that story was widely reported, but Cullen's research reveals that it never happened. It just goes to show how much misinformation can take hold, especially in the wake of, such a shocking event.
But if Harris wasn't driven by this, typical teenage angst of being an outcast, what does Cullen say was behind his actions?
Cullen argues that Harris was driven by a much deeper and frankly more disturbing ideology of achieving infamy and recognition through violence.
And Dylan Klebold, he always seemed like more of an enigma. What does Cullen reveal about him?
Klebold was a stark contrast to Harris. He was depressive, withdrawn, and heavily influenced by Harris's personality. But his journals reveal a tortured soul, suggesting his participation was more about self-destruction than any kind of shared ideology with Harris.
How do we reconcile Klebold's outward personality with his participation in such an act? What does Cullen's research reveal about that inner struggle?
Cullen paints a picture of Klebold as someone deeply susceptible to Harris's influence, a troubled soul seeking belonging and purpose. Klebold's journals express a profound sense of hopelessness and a desire to escape his own pain.
You mentioned that Cullen also digs into the failures that led to the tragedy.
He does, and one of the most striking things he reveals is that the school administration actually ignored a detailed report from a concerned parent. This report, sent a full year before the attack, outlined Harris's website, which was filled with violent threats and disturbing content.
It's chilling that such a clear warning sign was ignored.
It is, and it points to a larger issue of failing to recognize and address clear signs of danger. Cullen meticulously pieces together a timeline of missed opportunities. For example, Harris and Klebold had a history of petty theft and vandalism, which resulted in them being required to attend a diversion program. Despite escalating signs of violent behavior, they were allowed to complete the program early.
So we have a ignored parent report, a diversion program they should have been allowed to finish early, and what else?
Well, Cullen also revealed that the school had a specific policy against backpacks, yet Harris and Klebold entered with large duffel bags unnoticed. This points to a larger issue of security theater. We focus on superficial measures but miss the underlying problems.
So much of this seems to be about a failure to connect the dots.
That's a key takeaway here. There were so many warning signs that were missed or dismissed, partly because people struggled to believe that something like this could happen in their community.
That sense of denial can be so powerful.
It can, and in this case, it had tragic consequences.
It's almost like they couldn't comprehend the potential for violence, even when faced with clear evidence.
Precisely. And that disconnect speaks to a larger societal issue, one that we still struggle with today, taking warning signs seriously and intervening before it's too late.
We talked earlier about Eric Harris being a psychopath. Can you elaborate on what that meant in this context?
Well, Cullen meticulously examines Harris's writings and actions, revealing a chilling pattern of behavior. He wasn't just a troubled teen lashing out. Harris meticulously planned the attack, reveling in the anticipated chaos and aiming for a level of infamy that went beyond typical school shootings.
So for Harris, Columbine was more about creating terror and making a name for himself than any specific personal vendetta.
Exactly. Cullen's analysis suggests Harris had this grandiose sense of self, believing himself superior to others and relishing the power he thought he had over life and death. He wanted to be remembered. to leave a lasting mark on the world, and sadly, he succeeded in a horrific way.
And Dylan Klebold. How did someone seemingly so different become entangled in this horrific plan?
That's the question that continued to haunt many mural. Cullen's deep dive into Klebold's journals reveals a deeply troubled individual wrestling with depression, suicidal thoughts, and a profound sense of inadequacy. He was drawn to Harris's charisma and saw him as a sort of anti-hero.
But you said earlier that Klebold was complicit. If he was deeply depressed and suicidal, could we argue his agency was limited? Could it have been more about Harris's manipulation?
That's a difficult question, and Cullen doesn't shy away from the complexities. While Klebold's journals paint a picture of vulnerability and despair, it's crucial to remember he still made the conscious decision to participate. He actively contributed to the planning and execution of the attack. Cullen's work suggests that while Harris was the driving force, Klebold was more than just a passive follower.
This brings us back to the issue of mental health, something you've mentioned a couple of times already.
Yes, and Cullen doesn't let anyone off the hook here. He highlights the missed opportunities to intervene. Both Harris and Klebold displayed clear warning signs, threats, disturbing online content, and escalating behavioral problems. And these signs were either ignored or downplayed, suggesting a broader failure to recognize and address mental health issues.
It's like we wait for a crisis before we take mental health seriously.
And even then, our focus is often on punishment and blame rather than understanding and prevention. Cullen argues that we need to move beyond the stigma surrounding mental health and foster a culture where seeking help is encouraged and early intervention is prioritized.
This is a tough topic because people want answers and solutions, but as you said earlier, there are no easy ones.
Right, we can't reduce this tragedy to a single cause or a simple fix. Cullen's book urges us to look at the larger societal context, our attitudes toward mental health, the accessibility of treatment, the role of media, and the warning signs that are often missed.
You mentioned the media's role in all of this. It's so easy to get caught up in the sensationalism and lose sight of the facts.
Absolutely. Cullen dissects the media coverage after Columbine, highlighting how the rush to judgment and the desire for simplistic narratives contributed to the spread of misinformation and harmful stereotypes.
The story about Classy Bernal and her supposed martyrdom is a perfect example.
Exactly. That story, despite being debunked by Cullen and others, continues to circulate and shape people's perceptions of the event. It underscores the power of narratives and the importance of critical thinking when consuming media, particularly in the aftermath of tragedy.
Cullen doesn't just focus on the failures and the darkness surrounding Columbine. He also sheds light on the remarkable resilience of the community. What are some of the stories that stand out?
Well, one of the most powerful examples is Principal Frank DeAngelis. He remained at Columbine after the shooting, dedicating himself to rebuilding the school and supporting its students and staff. DeAngelis embodied a profound sense of leadership and compassion, helping to guide the community through an unimaginable period of grief and healing.
And then there's Patrick Ireland, the student who was shot in the head but managed to escape by crawling through a library window.
Ireland's story is truly remarkable. His recovery was a testament to his own incredible strength and determination, but it also highlights the importance of human connection. The outpouring of support from his family, friends, and the wider community undoubtedly played a crucial role in his journey.
These stories of resilience are incredibly important because they remind us that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope.
Absolutely. They showcase the power of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and find a path forward, even when it feels impossible.
Reading about Patrick Ireland, I was reminded of a conversation I had with a first responder after a different tragedy. He said it was those moments of human connection, of helping someone through the darkness that kept him going.
That resonates with Cullen's emphasis on the need for empathy and understanding. We need to see beyond the headlines and recognize the individuals impacted by such events. It's about moving past fear and judgment and fostering a sense of shared humanity.
Columbine forced a national reckoning with the realities of school violence. But looking back now, did we actually learn the right lessons?
That's a crucial question. While Columbine led to changes in school security measures and increased awareness of mental health issues, Cullen argues that we still have a long way to go. We tend to focus on reactive measures like metal detectors and active shooter drills, but those alone won't solve the problem.
So what's the alternative? What does Cullen suggest we focus on?
Cullen stresses the importance of addressing the root causes of violence, which means tackling issues like social isolation, bullying, and access to mental health resources. He advocates for a more proactive approach, fostering inclusive school environments and teaching empathy and conflict resolution skills.
That's a tall order, especially in a world that often seems so divided.
It is, but it's a challenge we must embrace. If we truly want to prevent future tragedies, we need to move beyond superficial fixes and address the underlying societal issues that contribute to violence.
Cullen's book really challenges us to think critically and confront difficult truths about ourselves and our society. But ultimately, what's the takeaway message? What does he want us to do with this knowledge?
Cullen's work doesn't offer easy answers, but it does provide a roadmap for understanding. He compels us to confront the complexities of violence, to challenge our assumptions, and to engage in honest conversations about difficult topics.
So it's not just about Columbine, it's about fostering a deeper understanding of human behavior and creating a world where tragedies like this become less likely.
Precisely. It's about taking individual responsibility, promoting empathy and compassion, and actively working towards a future where violence is no longer an acceptable solution.
And that leads to a question you posed earlier. What other unthinkable scenarios should we be preparing for today?
That's the question that lingers after reading Cullen's book. Columbine shattered the illusion of safety and forced us to confront the reality that the unimaginable can happen.
It's almost like asking, what are the blind spots we have now that we'll regret later?
Exactly. We need to challenge our own assumptions, to think critically about potential risks, and to be proactive in addressing vulnerabilities. Cullen's work reminds us that complacency can have devastating consequences.
It's like Cullen is urging us to not just look back and analyze what went wrong, but to look ahead and ask, what are we missing now? What could lead to another tragedy?
Exactly. It's about cultivating a mindset of vigilance, not just in terms of, like physical security, but also in terms of recognizing and addressing the underlying social and cultural factors that contribute to violence.
One of the things that struck me about Cullen's book is how thoroughly he researched it. He didn't just rely on news reports and, readily available information. He went deep, interviewing survivors, families, and delving into personal journals and documents.
Yeah, that's one of the strengths of his work. He goes beyond the surface level reporting and provides a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of the events and the people involved.
I remember reading the section about the families of the victims and their struggle to make sense of what happened. It was heartbreaking.
Yeah, Cullen wasn't shy away from the pain and the complexity of the aftermath. He gives a voice to the families, allowing them to share their grief, their anger, their search for meaning in the midst of tragedy.
He also humanizes Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, which I imagine wasn't easy to do.
Well, it's a delicate balance. He acknowledges the horror of their actions, while also attempting to understand the factors that led them down such a dark path. He presents them not as monsters, but as deeply troubled individuals who made horrific choices with devastating consequences.
It seems like the book is as much about understanding the roots of violence as it is about Columbine itself.
That's a great point. Cullen uses Columbine as a lens to examine broader societal issues, mental health, bullying, the influence of media, and the ways in which we often fail to recognize and address warning signs.
It's a lot to grapple with, but I think that's why this book is so important. It doesn't offer simple answers or quick fixes. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths and engage in difficult conversations.
And ultimately, I think that's what Cullen hopes to achieve. He wants us to learn from this tragedy, to move beyond fear and judgment, and to work towards creating a society where violence is no longer an acceptable option.
It's a powerful message, and one that resonates even more strongly today in a world that often feels so divided and volatile.
We live in a time where it's easy to retreat into our own echo chambers, to surround ourselves with people who think like us and reinforce our existing beliefs. But Cullen's work challenges us to break out of those echo chambers, to engage with different perspectives, and to cultivate empathy for those who may be different from us.
It's about building bridges rather than walls.
Precisely. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and working together to create a safer, more compassionate world for everyone.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What are some key takeaways you'd want our listener to remember?
First, I think it's crucial to understand that Columbine, while a horrific tragedy, is not an isolated incident. It reflects deeper societal issues that we still grapple with today. Second, we need to move beyond simplistic narratives and recognize the complexity of these events. There's no single cause or easy solution. And finally, we need to embrace the challenge of prevention. It's about fostering a culture of empathy, promoting mental health awareness, and addressing the underlying social and cultural factors that contribute to violence.
It's a call to action not just for policymakers and educators, but for each of us as individuals.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in creating a safer, more just, and more compassionate society.
It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure. And to you, our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has given you new insights and inspired you to continue exploring this complex issue.
Remember, it's about asking tough questions, challenging assumptions, and never losing sight of the human cost of violence.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.